I was standing in that deposition room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a court reporter's fingers clicking against her machine when my husband finally looked me in the eye for the first time in 6 months. His lawyer had just asked me to repeat the dates of the unauthorized transactions, and I was reading them off one by one, watching his face go gray with each number I spoke. My sister sat beside him, her hands folded on the table like she was praying, but I knew better. I'd spent 40 years praying while they were planning. This was the moment everything they'd built came crashing down, and all I felt was cold, clear certainty. But to understand how I got to that room, how a woman who spent her whole life trusting became the kind of woman who builds evidence files and hires lawyers, you have to go back to a Tuesday afternoon in summer when I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I was going through old photos in a shoebox from the closet that morning, the kind of thing you do when you're 64, and the grandkids are coming over and they want to see pictures of when their daddy was little. My apartment in this old brick building in Oak Park has good light in the mornings, comes through the fire escape and makes everything soft and golden. I had my royal purple robe on, the one I wear every morning, and the fan was spinning slow overhead because summer in Chicago makes everything heavy and thick. I had a pot of collard greens simmering low on the stove, filling the whole place with that smell of home and time and patience. My worn Bible sat on the nightstand beside the bed, open to Psalms like it always was, pages thin as tissue paper from all the years I'd turned them looking for answers. I found our wedding picture in that shoebox. Me at 24, him at 26, both of us so young we looked like children playing dress-up. I was holding a bouquet of white roses and wearing a dress my mother had sewn by hand, every stitch a prayer for a good marriage. He was looking at me like I was the only person in the world. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to remember what it felt like to be looked at that way, trying to pinpoint exactly when that look had changed into something else. I was supposed to be going to art school that year. I'd been accepted to the Art Institute, had scholarships lined up, had professors telling me I had real talent, but marriage came first. That's what everyone said. A good man wants to take care of you, my mother told me, and you don't turn that down for some dream about painting pictures. So I got married instead. I told myself there would be time later for art, for dreams, for the version of me that existed before I became somebody's wife. The grandkids never came over that day. My daughter called and said something came up, her voice tight and strange, and I thought maybe one of the kids was sick. I put the photos back in the shoebox and decided to go to the grocery store, get ingredients for their favorite cookies in case they could come by later in the week. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my purse and walked out into that heavy summer heat that makes the whole neighborhood move in slow motion. Oak Park is a mixed-income area with older homes near downtown, the kind of place where you see million-dollar Victorian houses on one block and Section 8 apartments on the next. I'd lived here for 37 years, raised 3 children in this apartment, knew every crack in the sidewalk and every face at the corner store. It was home in the way that becomes invisible, the backdrop to your whole life that you stop really seeing after a while. I was crossing the street toward the grocery store when I saw them. My husband and my sister, walking out of the First National Bank together. Not our bank. We banked at the credit union 2 miles away, had for decades. But there they were, coming through those glass doors. And he had his hand on her elbow the way he used to touch me 40 years ago when we were still young, and I still believed in the fairy tale. They were laughing about something, their heads close together, comfortable in a way that made my stomach drop. I stood there on the sidewalk holding my grocery bags that were still empty, just stood there frozen like someone had hit pause on my whole body. They didn't see me. They turned left and walked toward the parking lot, still talking, still laughing, and I watched them get into his car and drive away. His burgundy red Lincoln Navigator, the dream car he'd saved up for and bought himself last year without asking me, without including me in the decision, just came home one day with the keys in his hand and said this was his retirement present to himself. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that someone asked if I was okay. Long enough that the heat made sweat run down my back under my t-shirt. Long enough that I started questioning what I'd seen, started wondering if maybe it wasn't them, if maybe the heat was making me imagine things. But I knew what I'd seen. I went home without going to the grocery store. The collard greens had cooked down to almost nothing, and the pot was starting to burn. I turned off the stove and sat at the kitchen table and waited for him to come home. I had my quilting basket beside me, half-finished blanket for my youngest grandson spread across my lap, but my hands couldn't work the needle. I just sat there watching the fan spin overhead, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood through the open window, children playing in the street, someone's radio playing old Motown, the whole ordinary soundtrack of life continuing while mine was falling apart. He came home at 6 like always, kissed my forehead like always, asked what was for dinner like always, and I asked him where he'd been that afternoon. Just out running errands, he said. Nothing special. His voice was easy, comfortable, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. I watched him take off his shoes by the door, the same routine we'd done for 37 years. He hung his keys on the hook we'd installed together when we first moved in, back when I still believed we were building something permanent. I asked him if he'd been to the bank. The pause was barely noticeable, maybe half a second. But in a marriage that long, you learn to read the silence between words like some people read books. Which bank? He asked, and something in the way he said it, something careful in his tone, made my blood go cold. The First National downtown? I said, near the grocery store. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, something quick and calculating. And then he smiled. Oh, that, he said. Yeah, I ran into your sister there. Pure coincidence. She was having trouble with her account, and I helped her sort it out. No big deal. Why? Because I saw you, I said. I saw you come out together. I saw your hand on her arm. I saw you laughing. He looked at me like I'd just said something crazy. Baby, he said, and his voice got soft the way it did when he was about to tell me I was being unreasonable. You're making something out of nothing. I was helping your sister. That's what family does. Why are you acting jealous? That word. Jealous. Like the problem was me, my feelings, my perception, not what I'd seen with my own eyes. My sister came over that night. He must have called her. She walked in with her concerned face on, the one she used at funerals and hospital visits, and sat down beside me on the couch. She took my hands in hers and told me she was worried about me. Said I'd been acting strange lately, forgetting things, getting confused. Said maybe the stress of getting older was catching up with me. Said the bank thing was exactly what he'd told me. Just a coincidence. Just her needing help with a wire transfer that was confusing her. Why was I being so suspicious? Why couldn't I just trust that the people who loved me were telling the truth? I pulled my hands away. I'm not confused, I said. I'm not forgetting things. I know what I saw. She looked at my husband and something passed between them, some wordless communication that made me feel like I was watching a play, and I didn't know my lines. Maybe you should talk to someone, she said gently. A doctor. Just to make sure everything's okay. And that was when I understood. They weren't going to admit anything. They were going to make me the problem. Make me the unstable one. The paranoid wife. The woman who couldn't be trusted to know her own mind. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside my husband listening to him breathe, steady and peaceful like a man with a clear conscience, and I stared at the ceiling fan spinning in the dark. My Bible was on the nightstand where it always was, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. All those prayers I'd written in the margins about patience and trust, and letting God handle things, suddenly felt like lies I'd been telling myself to avoid seeing the truth. The next morning, I put on my royal purple robe and made coffee, and acted like everything was fine. He left for his Wednesday morning golf game, same as always. My sister called to check on me, her voice full of false concern, asking if I'd thought about what she'd said about seeing a doctor. I told her I'd think about it. I told her I loved her. I told her everything she wanted to hear. Then I got dressed, and I went to our credit union. I wanted to check our accounts, just to make sure I wasn't crazy. The teller pulled up our information, and everything looked normal at first. Joint checking, joint savings, the mortgage payment auto draft, the usual monthly expenses. But then I asked about recent activity, and she scrolled through the transactions and I saw it. A transfer I didn't recognize. $5,000 moved to an account number I'd never seen before. Then another one, $3,000 2 weeks earlier. Then another, $7,500, a month before that. My hands started shaking. When were these authorized? I asked. She looked uncomfortable. They were all done in person, she said, with your signature. Do you not remember making these transfers? Show me the signature, I said. She printed out the authorization forms, and there it was. My name in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. The M in Margaret, a little too round. The tail on the Y in Yates, a little too short. Someone had practiced my signature well enough to fool a teller who didn't know me personally, but not well enough to fool me. I sat in that credit union lobby and felt my whole world tilt sideways. This wasn't just about seeing them at a bank. This was theft. This was fraud. This was my own husband and my own sister stealing from me and then making me look crazy when I asked questions about it. The teller was asking if I was okay, and I realized I was crying. Not quiet tears, but big, gasping sobs that I couldn't control, 40 years of trust shattering in my chest all at once. I need to speak to a manager, I said. I need to freeze my accounts. I need to file a fraud report. The manager took me into a private office and I told her everything. The bank citing, the laughing, the excuses, the signatures that weren't mine. She listened with her face getting harder and harder, and then she made some calls. Within an hour, my accounts were frozen pending investigation. Within 2 hours, the police had been notified. Within 3 hours, I was sitting in my apartment staring at my phone, knowing I had to call my husband, knowing everything was about to explode. I didn't call him. I called my other sister instead, the one who lived 3 hours away and barely spoke to the rest of the family because she'd had her own falling out with them years ago. I told her everything, and she didn't sound surprised. She said she'd always known something was wrong with those two. Said she'd tried to tell me before, but I wouldn't listen. She said she was getting in her car right now and driving up to be with me. When my husband came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with all the bank statements spread out in front of me. He saw them, and his face went pale. "We need to talk," he said. And his voice wasn't easy anymore, wasn't comfortable. It was tight and scared, and that's how I knew everything I suspected was true. Before he could start explaining, before he could start spinning whatever story he'd prepared, I picked up my worn leather Bible from where it sat beside me. The one I'd carried for 30 years. The one with all my prayers written in the margins in fading blue ink. Prayers for patience when he was distant. Prayers for wisdom when things felt wrong. Prayers for peace when I couldn't sleep at night, wondering why our accounts never seemed to grow despite his assurances. The one that had been my constant companion through every hard thing I'd ever faced. I looked at it for a long moment, at all those underlined verses about patience and trust and waiting on the Lord. Psalms about trusting in Him with all your heart and leaning not on your own understanding. Proverbs about the virtuous wife who brings her husband good and not harm all the days of her life. Romans about how love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Every verse I'd used to convince myself to stay quiet, to stop asking questions, to trust when my gut was screaming that something was wrong. I felt something break loose in my chest, something that had been wound tight for years. And then I threw it as hard as I could against the wall. The sound it made was louder than I expected, a sharp crack like breaking bone. The spine split. Pages scattered across the floor like snow, like broken promises, like 40 years of prayers that had gone unanswered because I'd been praying to be patient with my abuser instead of praying for the courage to leave. My husband jumped back like I'd thrown it at him. "What the hell, Margaret?" he shouted, but I was already standing up, already walking toward him with something in my face that made him take another step back. Something he'd never seen before because I'd spent 4 decades making sure he never had to see me angry, never had to face the cost of his comfort. "You stole from me?" I said. You and my sister stole from me and you tried to make me think I was losing my mind. Don't you dare say anything else. Don't you dare try to explain. I've frozen the accounts. I've called the police. I've filed a fraud report. It's over. He tried. He spent the next hour trying. Saying it wasn't what I thought. Saying they were going to tell me. Saying the money was for a good reason, an investment opportunity, something that would benefit all of us. Saying they only hid it because they knew I'd worry, knew I wouldn't understand. His voice got angry when the excuses didn't work, told me I was being dramatic, told me I was going to regret this, told me I was tearing the family apart over nothing. I didn't respond. I just gathered up the pages of my Bible from the floor, smoothed them out, stacked them in a neat pile on the table. Each page felt like a prayer I'd wasted, a year I'd lost, a piece of myself I'd given away to people who were robbing me blind while I slept beside them. When my other sister arrived that night, she found me still sitting at the table with those Bible pages, my husband long gone to wherever people go when their lies catch up with them. She sat down across from me and took my hands and said the words I'd been needing to hear for months. You're not crazy. You're not paranoid. This is real and it's not your fault. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I slept on the couch with my sister sitting up in the chair beside me, keeping watch like I was a child who might have nightmares. And I did have nightmares. I dreamed about signatures forging themselves, about banks with doors that wouldn't open, about laughing that echoed through empty streets. I woke up gasping, and my sister was right there, reminding me to breathe, reminding me I was safe, reminding me that the hard part was just beginning, but I wasn't going to face it alone. Morning came whether I was ready or not. The summer heat was already thick by 7 a.m., and the fan was spinning, and somewhere in the building someone was cooking breakfast, and life was continuing like the world hadn't just ended. My sister made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she asked me what I wanted to do next. Not what I should do. What I wanted to do. I want them to pay, I said. I want everyone to know what they did. I want justice. She nodded. Then we get you a lawyer, she said. A good one. Someone who specializes in this kind of thing. I didn't know where to start. I'd never needed a lawyer before. I'd lived my whole life trying to avoid conflict, trying to smooth things over, trying to keep the peace. The idea of fighting back legally felt foreign and frightening, and also like the only thing that made sense. My sister started making calls. She had a friend who had a friend who knew someone. That's how these things work when you're starting from nothing. You follow threads until something catches. By noon, we had 3 names. By 2 p.m., we had appointments scheduled. By 4 p.m., I was sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Oak Park, telling my story to a woman named Patricia Chen, who listened without interrupting and took notes in a leather-bound book, and looked at me at the end with eyes that had seen this before. This is financial elder abuse, she said. And it's more common than you think. The fact that they tried to gaslight you about your mental state is actually typical. They were building a narrative that would protect them if you tried to report them. Making you look unstable was part of their plan. Hearing someone else name it, put words to what I'd been feeling, made something break open in my chest. I started crying again, and Patricia pushed a box of tissues across her desk and waited patiently while I pulled myself together. I'm sorry, I said. I keep crying. Don't apologize, she said. You're not falling apart. You're waking up. There's a difference. She explained what would happen next. Gathering evidence, filing formal complaints, possibly criminal charges depending on what we found. She talked about forensic accountants and subpoenas and depositions. All these legal terms that should have been intimidating but instead felt like tools I was finally being given to build something new. Patricia leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, looking at me with an intensity that demanded honesty. I need to ask you something important, she said. Are you prepared for this to get ugly? Really ugly? Because it will. Your husband will hire a lawyer who will try to paint you as vindictive, unstable, vengeful. Your sister will cry on the stand. Your children might be asked to testify about your mental state. Friends will choose sides. People you've known for decades will stop calling. Some will tell you that you're destroying the family over money. That forgiveness is more important than justice. Can you handle that? I sat with that question for a long moment. Through the window behind Patricia, I could see the street below, people walking to wherever they needed to go, living their ordinary lives without their worlds falling apart. Part of me wanted to be one of those people, wanted to go back to not knowing, back to trusting blindly, back to the comfortable lies I'd been living in. But that person was gone. She'd died on a sidewalk in summer heat watching her husband touch her sister's elbow like a lover. Yes, I said, I can handle it, because what I can't handle is knowing they did this and letting them get away with it. They already did, I said. They already made me the villain. I'm just making it official. She smiled at that. A quick, fierce smile that made me feel less alone. Good, she said, because we're going to need that attitude. Walking out of that office, I felt different. Not better exactly. Not fixed. But clearer. Like someone had cleaned a window I'd been looking through for years, and suddenly I could see the actual shape of things instead of just shadows and fog. My sister took me to dinner at a diner on Madison Street, and we sat in a booth by the window and ate burgers and fries, and didn't talk about any of it for an hour. Just talked about her kids and her garden and the neighbor who kept parking in her spot. Ordinary things that felt like medicine. I need to say something that might be hard for you to hear. I just need a minute to take all this in and really process what's happening here. Could we take a short break and grab some water? If you're going through something similar right now, I want you to know you're not alone. And this story matters. When we got back to my apartment that evening, there were 17 missed calls on my phone. My husband, my sister, my kids, all of them wanting to know what I was doing, why I was destroying the family, why I couldn't just let it go. I listened to 3 voicemails before I stopped. All of them said the same thing in different words. I was the problem. I was being vindictive. I was letting lawyers put ideas in my head. I needed to forgive and move on. I deleted every message without responding. My sister watched me do it and nodded approval. You don't owe them explanations, she said. You don't owe them anything. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I got out my old art supplies from the back of the closet, the ones I'd packed away when I got married and kept moving from apartment to apartment without ever opening. The box was in the back corner behind winter coats and old photo albums, covered in dust thick enough to write your name in. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it slowly, like I was opening a time capsule from another life. Brushes with bristles stiff from disuse. Tubes of paint dried to rocks. Sketch pads with pages yellowed at the edges. The top sheet showing a charcoal sketch I'd done of my mother's hands, work-worn and beautiful. I'd forgotten that drawing. Forgotten the girl who'd made it, who'd believed she had talent, who'd believed art was something she could build a life around. I pulled out a palette knife and the wooden handle was smooth in my palm, shaped by the grip of my younger self. I found acceptance letters from the Art Institute stuffed in the bottom of the box, dated 1981, full of words like exceptional promise and full scholarship and we look forward to having you join us. I'd never even called to tell them I wasn't coming. Just let the deadline pass. Let that whole future evaporate like it had never been real. My sister sat beside me and picked up a brush. The bristles were so stiff they stood straight up like a tiny broom. Do you remember how to do this? She asked gently. I don't know, I said, running my finger over the dried paint tubes, feeling the crack in one where color had leaked out and hardened decades ago. But I'm going to find out. Even if I have to relearn everything, even if my hands don't work the same way they did when I was young, I'm going to find out who I would have been if I hadn't given this up. I couldn't paint that night. My hands were shaking too badly, and my head was too full of lawyers and bank statements and betrayal. But I could clean the brushes. I could throw away what was ruined and make a list of what I needed to replace. I could take one small step toward becoming someone I'd abandoned decades ago. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Patricia called 2 days later and said the credit union's fraud department had found more transactions, going back almost 3 years. Over $40,000 total, moved in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts but large enough to add up to most of our retirement savings. Every signature mine, but not mine. Every transfer authorized in person at branches I'd never visited. Someone had been doing this systematically, carefully, for years. "It was my sister," Patricia said. "Your sister was the one making the transfers. Your husband provided the account information and the cover stories, but she was the one physically going to the banks with forged authorization forms. We have her on security camera footage at 4 different branches." I should have felt something hearing that. Rage or grief or betrayal. But all I felt was a weird, empty relief, like finally having proof meant I could stop doubting my own sanity. I asked Patricia what happened next, and she said we were filing for a restraining order and pursuing criminal charges and preparing for a civil suit to recover the money. She asked if I was ready for this to become public, for the whole community to know what happened. "Everyone already thinks I'm crazy," I said. "Let them see why." The restraining order went through in 48 hours. My husband and my sister were legally prohibited from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my apartment. That should have felt like protection, but instead it felt like confirmation that my marriage was over, my family was destroyed, everything I'd built my life around was gone. I sat on my couch and looked around my apartment, at 40 years of accumulated life, and tried to figure out who I was without any of it. My other sister stayed with me through all of it. She slept on the couch and made meals I couldn't eat, and answered my phone when I couldn't face it, and reminded me every morning that I was doing the right thing even when it felt like I was burning down my whole world. She was the one who suggested I start going to the senior center, just to get out of the apartment, just to be around people who didn't know my story and wouldn't judge me for it. I went reluctantly, expecting nothing, and found a quilting group that met every Tuesday morning. 8 women ranging from 60 to 85, sitting around a table with fabric and thread and decades of stories sewn into every stitch. They welcomed me without questions, showed me patterns I'd never tried, admired the blankets I'd made for my grandchildren, and asked if I'd teach them some of my techniques. For 2 hours every Tuesday, I got to be just Margaret, a woman who was good with her hands and had an eye for color. Not Margaret the victim, not Margaret the wife whose husband stole from her, not Margaret whose family had turned against her. Just Margaret. One morning I showed up early and one of the women, Louise, was already there setting up. She asked how I was doing in that way that meant she actually wanted to know, not just making conversation. And I found myself telling her everything. The bank, the fraud, the investigation, the family that hated me now for pressing charges. All of it spilling out while we arranged chairs and laid out fabric. Louise listened without interrupting, and when I finally stopped talking, she sat down and looked at me hard. She had those kinds of eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. The eyes of someone who'd survived things that should have broken her. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers weathered and strong from decades of needlework. "My daughter stole from me too," she said quietly. "Cleaned out my savings while I was in the hospital recovering from a stroke." I was lying in a hospital bed relearning how to speak, and she was at ATMs pulling out thousands of dollars. Took my credit cards and ran them up to the limit buying things for herself and her boyfriend. Electronics, furniture, a vacation to Mexico while I was in physical therapy trying to remember how to walk. Her voice didn't waver, but I could see the old pain flicker across her face like lightning behind clouds. When I got out and saw the statements, when I realized what she'd done, I called her. She cried, said she'd been desperate, said she'd pay it back, said she was sorry. But she kept spending. So I reported her, filed charges, got a restraining order. Louise paused, looking down at our joined hands. Half the family stopped speaking to me. Called me heartless, called me vindictive, said I was destroying her life, said she was my daughter. How could I do this to my own child? Like I was the one who'd betrayed the relationship, not her. "What did you do?" I asked. "I got my money back," she said. "I got a lawyer and I fought, and I won." "And the family members who cut me off?" I realized they were never really on my side to begin with. The people who loved me stood by me. The people who didn't revealed themselves. You'll see the same thing happen. It hurts now, but eventually you'll realize you didn't lose anything worth keeping. Those words carried me through the next 3 months. Through the depositions where I had to sit across from my husband and my sister and watch them lie under oath. Through the family members who called to beg me to drop the charges, to think about the children, to consider what this was doing to everyone. Through the nights when I lay awake wondering if I was making a mistake, if maybe I should have just let it go, if maybe preserving the family was worth more than getting justice. My other sister kept me grounded. Every time I wavered, she reminded me of the facts. They stole from you. They lied to you. They tried to make you think you were crazy. That's not family. That's abuse. And you don't have to protect your abusers just because they share your blood. The criminal case moved slowly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank surveillance footage, forged signatures, phone records showing coordination, financial trails showing where the money went. My sister had used most of it to pay off her mortgage and credit cards. My husband had used his share to buy that Lincoln Navigator and take a trip to Vegas I'd never known about. They'd spent my retirement on their own comfort while telling me I was paranoid for asking questions. The day of the settlement conference, I wore a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for court appearances, the most formal thing I owned that didn't feel like a costume. Patricia met me in the lobby of the courthouse and went over everything one more time. They were offering to pay back $30,000 of the $42,000 stolen in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. They wouldn't admit guilt, but they'd sign documents acknowledging the unauthorized transfers. It's not everything, Patricia said, but criminal cases are hard to prove, and this guarantees you get something back. It's your choice. I thought about Louise telling me she'd fought and won. I thought about all those mornings reading my Bible and praying for patience and trusting God to handle things. I thought about the 40 years I'd spent making myself smaller to fit into other people's comfort. I want the deposition, I said. I want them on record. I want the truth documented even if they never admit it. Patricia smiled. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The deposition room had fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick, and a table long enough to seat 8 people with too much space between them. My husband sat on one side with his lawyer. My sister sat beside him with hers. I sat across from them with Patricia beside me and a court reporter at the head of the table. For the first time in 6 months, we were all in the same room and nobody could walk away. Patricia started with my husband, asked him about the bank sighting, asked him about the account information, asked him about the signatures. He stuck to his story. He'd been helping my sister with legitimate financial matters. He'd never authorized any fraudulent transfers. He didn't know how my signature had ended up on those forms. Maybe I'd signed them and forgotten. Maybe the bank had made mistakes. Maybe. Then she turned to my sister. Asked her about the security footage showing her at 4 different bank branches on 4 different days. Asked her about the withdrawals that matched the unauthorized transfers penny for penny. Asked her how she explained having $40,000 in her account that couldn't be traced to any legitimate income. My sister started to cry. Said she'd been desperate. Said she'd been going to pay it back. Said she'd never meant to hurt me. Said family should forgive each other. Patricia let her cry for exactly 30 seconds and then asked her next question. If you were planning to pay it back, why did you tell everyone your sister was having mental problems? Why did you try to convince her family she was unstable? My sister didn't have an answer for that. She just kept crying and looking at her lawyer, who finally stepped in and said his client wouldn't be answering any more questions. That was when I spoke for the first time. I looked across the table at both of them and said the thing I'd been practicing for months. You didn't just steal my money. You stole my peace of mind. You stole my confidence. You stole my sense of reality. You made me question my own sanity rather than admit what you were doing. That's not something you can pay back. That's not something I can forgive. I hope the legal consequences are worth what you gained, because you've lost me forever. My husband finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something like regret flicker across his face. But it was too late. Years too late. Decades too late. I wasn't the woman he'd married anymore. I wasn't the woman who would have accepted his excuses and prayed for patience and waited for God to fix things. I was someone new, someone harder, someone who knew her own worth. We settled that day. $35,000 to be paid back over 18 months. Restitution for the documented losses. No admission of guilt, but the depositions on record for anyone who cared to look. My lawyer called it a win. I called it closure. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the summer heat hit my face, and for the first time in months, it felt good instead of oppressive. My other sister was waiting by her car, and when she saw my face, she smiled. "It's over," I said. "It's really over." "Not quite," she said. "Now comes the good part. Now you figure out who you're going to be next." I filed for divorce 2 weeks later. My husband didn't contest it. By that point, he knew better than to fight me on anything. The apartment lease was in my name, so he moved out, took his burgundy Lincoln Navigator and his golf clubs and his wounded pride, and disappeared into whatever life he was building without me. My kids called sometimes. Awkward conversations where they tried to maintain relationships with both of us and didn't know how to talk about any of it. I didn't push. I figured time would show them who their parents really were. My quilting group at the senior center became my anchor. Every Tuesday morning, I showed up with fabric and thread and spent 2 hours with women who understood that healing was something you did one stitch at a time. I started taking commissions, making quilts for people who wanted something custom, something meaningful. I poured all the emotions I couldn't speak into fabric, created pieces that told stories of betrayal and survival and hope. One of my quilts caught the attention of a gallery owner who came to the senior center for an unrelated event. She asked if she'd ever considered showing my work, and I laughed because it had been 44 years since anyone had asked me that question. But she was serious. She wanted 3 pieces for a show about women artists over 60, about art made from life experience and loss and transformation. I made those 3 pieces in a white-hot fever of creativity I hadn't felt since I was 23 and dreaming about art school. I called them Forgery, Gaslighting, and Liberation. Each one used my old quilting patterns but broke them apart and reconstructed them in ways that weren't comfortable or pretty but were true. The gallery owner hung them in her front window and they sold in the first week. That first money I'd earned from my own work in over 4 decades, felt different than anything else I'd ever touched. It was mine. Not our money or family money or money I had to justify spending. Mine. I took half of it and bought new art supplies. I took the other half and put it in an account only I could access. I started cooking for myself the way I'd never cooked when I was married. Not what anyone else wanted. Not what would make someone happy or keep someone satisfied. Just what I wanted. Some mornings that meant collard greens for breakfast because I could. Some nights that meant ice cream for dinner because nobody was there to judge. Every meal became an act of liberation, a small reclaiming of autonomy I'd given away so long ago, I'd forgotten what it felt like to choose. My other sister started talking about selling her house and finding something we could share. 2 old women growing old together on our own terms. We looked at places near her current neighborhood, small houses with porches and gardens, close enough to her kids and grandkids that family would still be part of our lives, but far enough that we'd have our own space, our own peace. It felt like planning a future instead of just surviving a present. Louise from the quilting group told me about her daughter, the one who'd stolen from her, who'd recently tried to reconnect. She'd wanted money again. Louise had said no, and hung up, and felt nothing but relief. "That's how you know you've healed," she told me. "When their attempts to manipulate you just bounce off like rain on a windshield. When you're not angry anymore because you're not invested anymore. When you're just done." I wasn't there yet. I was still angry. Still hurt. Still waking up some mornings with my chest tight, and my mind racing through everything that had been taken from me. But I could see that place Louise described, that place of complete indifference, and I was moving toward it one day at a time. The full restitution came through in 18 months exactly as ordered. $35,000 deposited into my new account. The one only I controlled. It wasn't everything they'd stolen, but it was enough to rebuild my retirement, enough to feel like justice had some material form. I didn't tell anyone when the last payment cleared. I just sat in my apartment and looked at the balance and felt something settle in my chest that had been tense for years. I started teaching quilting classes at the community center, passing on techniques I'd learned over decades to women who wanted to create something beautiful with their hands. Some of them were young mothers looking for a creative outlet. Some were older women like me, looking for community and purpose. All of them brought their own stories to the fabric, their own losses and hopes and dreams stitched into every piece they made. One of my students asked me once why I'd started quilting in the first place. I told her it was what women in my family did, what my grandmother had taught my mother and my mother had taught me. But that wasn't the whole truth. I'd started quilting because it was something I could control, something I could create that was mine even when everything else in my life belonged to other people. Every blanket I made was an act of resistance against my own disappearing. I told my student that, and watched her face change as she understood. She was 32 and recently divorced, rebuilding her life after her husband had cleaned out their accounts and left her with 2 kids and a mountain of debt. "You're going to be okay," I told her. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. You're going to wake up one morning and realize you're not just surviving anymore, you're actually living. And it's going to feel like being born again." Now I'm 64 years old and sitting in my apartment in Oak Park with my royal purple robe on and a cup of coffee beside me and a canvas on my easel that's half finished. Outside my window, the summer heat is making everything shimmer, and the fan is spinning, and somewhere in the building someone is cooking breakfast, and life is continuing the way it always does, whether you're ready or not. I've been painting more than quilting lately. Something about putting brush to canvas feels more immediate, more honest. My quilts were beautiful, but careful, every stitch planned and measured. My paintings are messier, rawer, more willing to be ugly in service of truth. I painted my worn leather Bible, the one I threw against the wall, pages scattered across the floor like judgment. I painted the bank lobby where I sat crying while a stranger told me I wasn't crazy. I painted the deposition room with its fluorescent lights and long table, and the faces of people I'd loved who'd turned into strangers. The gallery owner wants to do a solo show of my work. She's calling it Theft and Recovery, and she wants 15 pieces. I have 9 finished and 6 in progress. Every time I paint, I discover something new about what happened to me, some layer of betrayal or resilience I hadn't fully processed yet. Art is cheaper than therapy and more honest than prayer. At least when you paint something, you can see exactly what it is. You can't gaslight yourself when the evidence is right there on the canvas. My kids call more often now. Not all of them, but 2 out of 3, and that's better than nothing. They've started to understand what their father did, started to see the patterns they'd missed or excused when they were younger. My middle daughter called last week, and her voice was different than it had been in months. Smaller. Younger. Like she was a child again, trying to understand something too big for her comprehension. "Mom," she said, and then stopped. Started again. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I waited, holding the phone against my ear, looking out my window at the street below where life was continuing like always. "Dad asked me for money last month," she said. "Told me he was having a rough time, that the legal fees were killing him, that he just needed a loan to get through, and I almost gave it to him. I had my checkbook out. But then I asked him why he needed it if he still had the Navigator, if he was still playing golf every Wednesday, if his lifestyle hadn't changed at all. And he got angry. Really angry. Started telling me I was just like you, paranoid and vindictive, that you'd poisoned me against him." She took a shaky breath and I heard her crying softly. "That's when I realized," she said. "That's when I understood what you'd been trying to tell us. Because someone who's actually struggling doesn't get angry when you ask reasonable questions. Someone who's telling the truth doesn't try to make you feel crazy for wanting proof. Someone who loves you doesn't manipulate you by comparing you to someone else like it's an insult. One of them apologized for not believing me right away. I told her I understood. It's hard to accept that someone you love is capable of betrayal. It's easier to blame the person pointing it out than to face the truth. But eventually, the truth wins. It always does. I just wished it didn't take so long, didn't cost so much, didn't require so much proof before people would believe the evidence of their own experiences. I want you to understand something about financial abuse because I didn't understand it until I lived through it. It's not just about money. It's about power and control and making someone dependent so they can't leave even when they should. Studies calculate that the consequences of childhood trauma cost $14 trillion per year. And so much of that trauma comes from betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect us. When your foundation is broken that early, you spend your whole life not trusting your own judgment, second-guessing your own instincts, accepting treatment you should never accept because you don't believe you deserve better. Medical studies indicate that social isolation increases the risk of death by 29%, and isolation is exactly what financial abusers create. They cut you off from people who might help you see the truth. They make you doubt your friends, distrust your family, question your own perceptions. They build a cage out of confusion and self-doubt, and by the time you realize you're trapped, you've forgotten how to escape. So here's what I learned and what I want you to know if you're going through something similar. First, get separate accounts. I don't care if you're married, if you're in love, if you trust them completely. Get your own account that only you can access. Check your statements every single month. Know where every dollar goes. Don't sign anything you haven't read thoroughly. Don't let anyone make you feel paranoid or untrusting for asking questions about your own money. Your financial security is not something you owe anyone access to. Second, if someone tries to convince you that you're crazy or confused or imagining things, that's a red flag the size of a house. Trust your instincts. Trust what you saw. Trust what you felt. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't pray about it and hope it resolves itself. Don't wait for God to fix what you have the power to fight. I did that for 3 years, and it cost me $40,000 and nearly cost me my sanity. Third, document everything. Save texts, save emails. Save receipts and statements and any physical evidence you can find. Take photos, make copies. Put it somewhere safe that only you can access. Because if you ever need to prove what happened, you're going to need that evidence. People will lie. People will deny. People will try to rewrite history to make themselves look better. But documents don't lie. Fourth, find your people. Not your family necessarily, because sometimes family is the problem. But find the people who believe you, who support you, who won't try to talk you out of protecting yourself. Louise from my quilting group probably saved my life just by telling me her story, just by showing me that survival was possible. My other sister kept me sane when everyone else was trying to make me doubt my own mind. You need people like that. You can't do this alone. And finally, don't sacrifice your dreams for people who are stealing your future. I gave up art school at 23 because I believed marriage was more important. I spent 40 years making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, trying to be the kind of wife who deserved to be loved. And the whole time the person I'd sacrificed everything for was robbing me blind. That's the real betrayal. Not just the money, the time, the self. The version of me that might have been if I'd chosen differently. I can't get those 40 years back. But I can paint now. I can quilt. I can teach. I can choose what I eat for breakfast and wear what I want and spend my money on myself without justifying it to anyone. I can sleep at night knowing that my accounts are secure and my decisions are my own, and nobody is gaslighting me into doubting my own reality. That's not nothing. That's everything. So where are you listening from? What's your story? Are you the woman who's starting to suspect something's wrong, but everyone's telling you you're paranoid? Are you the daughter who's watching her mother get exploited and doesn't know how to help? Are you the friend who suspects your friend's husband is stealing from her but doesn't know how to bring it up? Leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what you need to hear, because isolation is the enemy, and community is the cure, and we're all in this together whether we know it or not. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear it, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories about survival and justice and women who refuse to stay silent. And if you're going through something similar right now, remember, you're not crazy, you're not paranoid, you're not imagining things. Trust yourself, document everything, find your people, and fight. Because you deserve better than being stolen from by people who claim to love you. You deserve the truth and justice and a life that's entirely your own.